Hello and welcome to Interesting History. Something a little bit out of the ordinary today. We're taking a look at a modern day speech done by President Donald Trump recently that sparked various headlines. And while this show isn't necessarily built to be a current politics show, I think it is very important when someone of a high profile speaks about history that it should probably be correct. So today's episode, we're going to take a look at about a 2.5-minute section of his speech, give a little bit of further detail on what he says, and try to provide a little bit further context on what he is actually speaking about with the various characters he brings up. So you haven't heard about the speech itself. CNN, NBC News, CBS News all labeled it as Donald Trump calling out Robert E. Lee as a great general. And while that actually doesn't bother me necessarily, because Robert E. Lee was a good general for what he was trying to do, just as you would say George Washington was a good general for what he had to do. The rest of the speech, in which he talks about Ulysses S. Grant and Abraham Lincoln, is a little bit off. And as he goes through, I want to take a look at not only those characters, but also William McKinley, President of the United States from Ohio, which he is speaking at. So let's take a look at the speech, and we'll go from there.
Ohio is the state that gave us a great president who hasn't been properly recognized, okay? William McKinley has not been properly recognized. What he did in terms of trade, in terms of war, but in terms of trade, and I hate to say it, in terms of being smart and tariffs, William McKinley has not been properly recognized, but maybe someday he will.
William McKinley is actually a really interesting call out here, considering that he is a president that was pro-big business. He increased tariffs to help protect workers. But the other big thing that he got passed was the Gold Standard Act, which made it so that only gold was the backing of the currency, which was something we don't necessarily think of as like a big time debate in today's society, just because the money is backed by the U.S. government now instead of gold, air quotes. But for like multiple elections in the turn of the 20th century, whether or not like gold was going to back the currency, whether it was going to be gold and silver, whether it was going to be gold and other precious metals, was actually a really, really big thing, because it kind of depended on whether or not farmers and workers could also help back the currency. Another thing I think is important to call out is he mentions in terms of war, and that actually is the Spanish-American War, the first real imperialist war that the U.S. fought against Spain, invaded Cuba, and we won a battle outside of the Philippines where we got to annex in the peace treaty Puerto Rico, Guam, Philippines. Cuba was promised independence, but then we kind of just hung around. Same for kind of the Philippines as well. And McKinley was also president while we annexed the Republic of Hawaii. But the real reason that William McKinley isn't really remembered as one of the big-time U.S. presidents is because he gets assassinated in 1901, and it is followed by who a lot of people think could be argued as the number one president if you were to make a top 10 list, and that's Theodore Roosevelt, who actually had only been on the job as vice president since the most recent election. And McKinley didn't have a vice president for 2 years. But the reason he isn't remembered, and Trump calls this out, is that he's succeeded by Theodore Roosevelt.
It also gave you a general who was incredible. He drank a little bit too much. You know who I'm talking about, right? So Robert E. Lee was a great general.
This is the clip that kind of had the news outlets in an uproar and calling out Robert E. Lee as a great general, which I don't necessarily think is a bad thing. If you're looking at strictly military causes, Robert E. Lee fought the Civil War, the way that he kind of needed to, and that was just to kind of keep the South alive and try to get major victories to lower morale for the Union side. I don't really have a problem with him calling a great general, but we'll talk a little bit more here about what he has to say about Ulysses S. Grant.
And Abraham Lincoln developed a phobia. He couldn't beat Robert E. Lee. He was going crazy. I don't know if you know this story, But Robert E. Lee was winning battle after battle after battle. And Abraham Lincoln came home. He said, I can't beat Robert E. Lee. And he had all of these generals. They looked great. They were the top of their class at West Point. They were the greatest people. There's only one problem. They didn't know how the hell to win. They didn't know how to fight. They didn't know how. And one day, it was looking really bad. And Lincoln just said, you hardly knew his name. And they said, don't take him. He's got a drinking problem.
Now, obviously, the comment that he says here about Lincoln not knowing who Grant was is a little bit far-fetched, considering that Grant would have captured 2 Confederate armies by the time he was made the leader of the Army on the Potomac. He would have won at Vicksburg, captured an army there. He would have captured another army further south. He would have known. It's actually ludicrous to think that he wouldn't have known. Now, the drinking problem thing, it's kind of just how Grant has been known and written about. And I actually just went and saw Ron Chernow speak a couple weeks ago now. And his most recent biography is actually on Grant. And I still need to read it, but just kind of from what he has said, I think just from what he says, let me say that again. The drunkenness has kind of been overplayed. Maybe earlier in his life before he became a general, he goes from being in the army in the Mexican-American War, and then after that he goes all the way down in society as to selling firewood on the street corner. That's what his life has become, and then the Civil War brings him back up again. So it's another one of those from poverty to hero sort of stories. And I think that's where the alcoholism kind of gets overblown. It's also a time period thing. Alcohol was very big in America. Whiskey, most of it was safer than water, right? You're in an army where dysentery is quite bad. If you drink water near an army camp, good luck. You'll be lucky to survive it. And I think the thing that Ron Chernow had said was that he died of throat cancer, not liver cancer, right? So it was the cigars, not necessarily the alcohol, that killed him.
And Lincoln said, I don't care what problem he has, you guys aren't winning. And his name was Grant, General Grant. And he went in and he knocked the hell out of everyone. And you know the story. They said to Lincoln, you can't use him anymore. He's an alcoholic. And Lincoln said, I don't care if he's an alcoholic. Frankly, give me 6 or 7 more just like him. He started to win. Grant really did. He had a serious problem, a serious drinking problem. But man, was he a good general. And he's finally being recognized as a great general. But Lincoln had almost developed a phobia because he was having a hard time with a true great fighter and a great general, Robert E. Lee. But Grant figured it out. And Grant is a great general, and Grant came from right here. Ulysses S. Grant.
I do think that calling him an unheard of and finally getting the credit that he deserves general is a little bit off here. Mostly because at the time, he was kind of considered another Washington. He literally goes from general. Andrew Johnson is president for 3 to 4 years. He then serves 8 years. A little bit iffy as a president, but a lot of people thought that towards the end he could have even have gone for a 3rd term and still won it, mostly due to the fact that the North had kind of secured presidency for quite a while in Reconstruction. He had quelled the Ku Klux Klan in the South, and he was going through and trying to reintegrate the South into the Union. So to say that he's little known and doesn't get the credit he deserves, I think in the Civil War researched circles, which I'm not a part of, but even I know that they consider Grant to be a very, very good general, a very modern general in the way that he fought, right? You grab the enemy, you keep contact with them, you keep giving casualties, and you wear them down, which the Union needed to do because they had more material, they had more manpower, and that was how they were going to win the war. I want to thank you all very much for listening. This is kind of just a one-off episode, and a current event thing that we'll do every once in a while as these sorts of things come up. Normally, I post once a week with questions from Reddit, anywhere from 3 to 5 questions, depending on how quickly I can get them answered, anywhere ranging from hopefully 10 to 20 minutes. And we'll be doing long-form, sort of hardcore history-esque episodes on large topics that I want to kind of dig my teeth into and talk about for hopefully like 3-ish hours. We'll see how that goes. If you are interested in just watching a video with this on the background, YouTube, there'll be a link in the chat or in the episode notes below. I also have a website, interesting-history.com, where all of the episodes are posted. You can go and it's split out between whether it's an interesting history or it's a questions from Reddit series sort of thing. Thank you guys very much again for listening, and I will hopefully talk to you again sometime soon.